So I am Micah Anders. I am a professional genealogist, historian, public artist, historic placemaker. I do a lot. I was given the opportunity to have a fellowship with the Minnesota African American Heritage Museum and Gallery, which is in Minneapolis. I live in St. Paul, and I submitted a proposal. And I said, I would like to research the early African Americans in southeast Minnesota, specifically these 11 counties, which we are currently in. And I had done some research ahead of time for some of my clients, and they had family who had been in Rochester, in Kaysen, in Red Wing, and in Owatonna. So I knew there were people down here, even early. All of that was 1800s. But I'd tried to do some research. A lot of people with whom I spoke, they said, that's not true. There weren't any black people down there. That didn't happen. They came later. They came in the 20s. They came in the 50s, depending on where I went. And I said, no, I don't think that's true. I have records. I have documents. So I know there are people there. But then I thought, but how many people were there, right? Like, was it just 2 or 3 and that's why nobody knows? You know, what happened? Why does nobody know this history? And so when I saw the opportunity for this fellowship, I jumped on it because I was just really excited to really do the work, because it's a lot of work. And to do it as a volunteer was a lot. You know, I'm a mom, I've got a family, things like that. So to have an opportunity to be paid and to be supported. So not only to do the work for me, but to know that there would be an outcome at the end that I could share with other people, that really mattered to me as well. Because I think our history is for everybody, right? That's why we're at a historical society right now. We all need to know our history. We all need to know where we came from, who else came from the same places or different places than we did. So for the next hour or so, I'll try and do about 45 minutes so that we have about 15 minutes to talk at the end if people have questions. I'm going to talk to you about some of my research, who I found, tell you some stories. Some will be about Rice County. Some will be some of the other counties in the area. But the reason I tell the various stories is they all are kind of themes. So each story, you almost have to think of representing more than just that person. So these are just people who represent specific types of histories, specific ways people came here. So for every person I found, there are so many others that either I just don't have in the presentation, or we are still finding. Even after this first round is done, we're still finding people. So this is the question I always heard. There were black people here? So I said, yes, there were. This represents census data. So the top, the little red bar, is 1860. In 1860, in that 11 counties, there were 51 people. Now, it's not a lot. It's probably about 1% of the population. But that's still a lot more than a lot of people thought were here, right? And even all of these numbers, even the 1880 count of almost 300 people, they're all undercounts. Every single one of those is not the accurate number. Sometimes because somebody will be written in one census as black, and the next census 10 years later, they were listed as white. Just because either their complexion was lighter, so people just said, oh, you know, that person's lighter complected, so we think they're white. Or because there may have only been a couple people. And so the census taker just put a W at the top of the page, put a line down the page, and didn't really think too much about it. So these numbers are undercounts. And just remember, this is about 1% of the population. But think about it, 1880, there's still almost 300 African Americans living in these 11 counties. So the first thing was to figure out, okay, well, they're all from somewhere else. So how did they get here? Why did they come here? And when did they come here? A lot of people came after the Civil War, but there are some people, some people who actually came when Minnesota wasn't even a state yet. It was still just a territory. So one of these groups, and don't worry, all of these images, I'll explain them. You don't need to understand them, but this is a census record. And this census is actually not from my 11 county radius. This is actually from Le Sueur County. There was a group, and this right here. So you see how all these are blank, blank, blank? those people were all white. They didn't even put their race because almost everybody was white. This is a MU for mulatto person, which would be sort of a light complected person, a B for black, and so on and so on. So this random grouping, this is a pretty big group of at least 3 households who were living in Tyrone, which is in LeSueur County. These families all came together from North Carolina before the Civil War. They were all born free. Their parents were born free. And they, for some reason, there was a sense that the Civil War was coming. Life was changing for them, even as free people. And they decided to move, of all places, and nobody knows why yet, to Minnesota. Nobody's still sure what made them think, you know, we're going to leave North Carolina and travel all the way to Minnesota. But not only did they live here, they had property. They owned land. They had personal property of some significance. But here's what's interesting. This is the same thing, zoomed in a little bit. 2 of these people, from 2 different families who came, John Boone and a woman named Missouri Pittman, they ended up moving. So they started here. The 2 of them ended up not only moving, they married, and they moved to Rice County. So John Boone, and there are no pictures of a lot of the people I'm going to show, so I tried to find something for you to look at visually while I jibber jabber at you. So the Boones, again, they were born in Kentucky. John Boone and Missouri were both born in around the 1840s. They married. They moved to Northfield. They had 10 children together. They seemed to have a pretty decent life in Northfield. Their kids had jobs in the town, and their granddaughter actually became the first African-American person to attend St. Olaf College. So this legacy started very early. Again, they were here before this was even a state. And I think for a lot of people it's like, whoa, I wouldn't have ever thought that. So there's pictures of their children. But for this, I'm not going to talk too much about people's descendants, but for this example, I'm going to, and I'm going to tell you why. So obviously, that's me in the middle. This is my presentation. You see the boards in the background. That's my actual museum exhibition. So with the talk, I did an actual exhibition that's up in the museum and will be here at some point in the future. These 2 ladies on either side of me are 2 of the descendants of the Boones. Does anybody notice anything about these ladies? They're pretty white. So, and very blonde. So, the Boones are not a unique story, but part of the story of the early African Americans is some people chose to pass. Some people said, you know, I'm light complected enough, and I can see that whichever town I'm living in, maybe my treatment would be different if I looked different. And they made a conscious decision to pass. Other people, they stayed sort of who they were as an African American person. But again, there weren't a lot of other African American people, and more men came than women. So sometimes when they married, they had an interracial marriage. And I'll talk about that later as well. And so then their kids would become lighter complected. And then if their kids ended up marrying another person who was also white, they would just get lighter and lighter, just naturally over time, right? In this case, these 2 ladies are 3rd cousins. They'd never met until actually I did this project. The lady on the, what side is that for you guys? Left, thank you. She is the granddaughter of Marlis Boone, who was the first African American at St. Olaf I was just talking about. She never knew. She knew her grandma. She grew up with her grandma. She never knew her grandma was black. She never told her. Same thing happened here. The other lady, her grandpa, was actually sent away from where they were living to Canada to be raised with his mom, who was Swedish, with her parents, his grandparents. He never knew he was part African American. She never knew her grandpa was African American. So you never know, you know? They both took DNA tests. They came up with a small percentage of black. They kind of thought, oh, that must be something about slavery or somebody from the South. It never occurred to them that just 2 generations before them, somebody was white passing. So I just add that in. This is the only time I'm going to talk about descendants. But the reason is because I had a lovely, lovely time with the two of them, and we met with Jeff, who is a local historian. He lives in Northfield, and he actually found the gravestones for the Boones I was just telling you about, John in Missouri. So their gravestones are in Northfield. So John was actually a soldier in the colored troops in the United States Civil War. So although he was already free and already living in Minnesota, he decided to serve his country, enlisted in Minnesota, and joined the United States Colored Troops. Now, the Civil War was segregated. So if you were African American or looked it, because I have actually found some African Americans who were in the non-segregated units, but they were very fair complected. So because the Minnesota never had enough African American soldiers, he went down to Missouri and he served there. So from Missouri, he went and had his service. After the war, he came back. His family had all moved by then to Northfield, and that's where they lived for the rest of their time. Some of their kids stayed, some of their kids left, and eventually all of their descendants have left. Now, this was the lady on the left I was just showing you. She so happens to be, that's her grandma Marlis, who was the first African American to graduate from St. Olaf. She was raised in Arizona. Marlis moved to Arizona. By some crazy fluke, a few months before she met me, she got a job in Fargo as a newscaster. So because of her introduction to me, this project, and her own, personal genealogy journey, she did almost a 30-minute documentary on this story. So it's with Valley News Live, something like that, out of Fargo, and it's online. So you can look up Rooted in Secret and actually watch that documentary that she made. It's fascinating. Okay, that's all about the descendants. Now back to the people we're talking about. I digress a little because that's just like a new development that happened. Okay, so Jane and Jerry Pope are one of the first families I found. When I was doing this work way back in 2014, in 2014, I was just finding a few families. And Jane and Jerry Pope, they lived in Owatonna. And when I found their obituaries, they were listed as founding members, early pioneers of Owatonna. But nobody's heard of them. So it just seemed like, wait a minute. Everybody knows some of the early pioneers. Those are the people that we remember. Those are the people that are talked about. Their names are on things. Unfortunately, both of them died after their children, so they had no legacy to help make sure they were remembered. Both Jane and Jerry were born in Kentucky in the 1820s. I have no clue how they came to Minnesota. A lot of the families, we think about our family histories. For me, on my mom's side, I can tell you how people migrated across from Europe. I can tell you where they settled. I can tell you their homestead. On my dad's side, people just kind of show up places. That's really the case here as well. I know they were in Kentucky because it says it on their records. I have no documentation of them before they lived in Minnesota. They just all of a sudden were in Minnesota. So Jerry actually had one of the very first barbershops in Owatonna. He was the only barber in town. And so he had customers who were white, mostly. There weren't really any other black people there at the time. But he was a really enterprising man. He was very involved in community. He was very involved in civic duties. He actually spent some time working to try and get a black delegate to the Republican Party. He worked when he was trying to get black people, black men specifically, the right to vote. So although he was possibly born enslaved, likely born enslaved based on when and where he was born, he could not read. He could not write. He started his own business. This is an ad from the newspaper that he put up about his shop. I love it. Shave you completely, it says. It was a big, big deal that he was still able to have his own business and still able to be politically active when you think about where his life may have started. Unfortunately, for this story and for many, I know more about the men than the women. And if you've ever done your own family history, you might find that you've probably noticed the same thing. Oftentimes the women didn't work, so there might not be a newspaper article with an ad for their job, for example. One thing I do know is Jane Pope lived to be in her 90s, which was pretty impressive. Again, all of their children died before they did, and she died alone. in the county home. And I have her death certificate. There's almost no information on it because nobody knew that much about her, even though she's a founder of the town and lived to be in her 90s. So some people came by choice. Again, I don't know if Jane and Jerry Pope came by choice, but I know that the Boones came by choice. Some people were brought to Minnesota. Some people were brought by choice, sort of, hey, would you like to come to Minnesota? I'm going to bring you. Some people were forcibly brought. In this case, we're going to tell a little bit of a story about this person right here. On this is a census from 1865. It is for a woman named Mary McElroy. So in the 1865 census, the only way you can find anybody who's African American is this little line right here. That's it. The first line is for male. The second line's for female. This line is for colored, as it was called at the time. Then there was like deaf, dumb and blind, and soldier. There's no ages. There's no sense of where they lived beforehand. It's literally just a line. And what's really been fascinating about this work is there's a lot of people that I've found in some of these early 1865 records with just that line, and then they're just gone. I never find them again in any records. But if you've done your own genealogy, you know that it's helpful to have something to try and find somebody, right? An age, a place of birth, something that will help you find them. Now, this story was really fascinating. I couldn't find her on any other records, but what I noticed were these two little marks. So remember I told you that's for soldiers. So Benjamin and Daniel Densmore were Civil War soldiers. They were white. As you see, they don't have the little mark. Randomly, their papers are at Minnesota Historical Society. Boxes and boxes and boxes of letters in their hands, in their voice, between the two sons and their dad. Most of them are not that interesting. Hi, Dad. Nothing's going on. We're still at a fort somewhere. That's what most of them say. Let me tell you about the weather and I'm going to draw you a picture. Great. In the middle of these papers, though, were these letters about a shady question. So Orrin Densmore, the father, and this is in Red Wing. Orrin Densmore, the father, was talking to his son Daniel and his other son Benjamin. Daniel was stationed in St. Louis and Benjamin was in actually a few different places, but both of them were in charge of the United States Colored Troops because most of the officers in charge of the United States Colored Troops were white. And actually a lot of them were from Minnesota. Do you know why? I don't either, but a lot of them were from Minnesota. So they came up with this scheme, and I don't know what other word to call it, honestly, so they had housekeepers who were oftentimes Swedish. And a lot of the Swedes who were their housekeepers, they didn't like it. They felt really isolated, right? Because a lot of the Densmores, for example, they were from the South. And the Swedes were feeling very isolated. They didn't know anybody else. Nobody spoke their language. So they didn't stay very long because they didn't have community. So they thought, okay, maybe we can find some people who are more accustomed to a life of service, who are more accustomed to, certain working conditions. And so the father sent his sons out on this mission to find what's called a contraband. Has anybody ever heard that word before to refer to a person? So a contraband is a person who used to be enslaved, but once the Union Army came through the South, they joined sort of almost like a refugee camp situation on the Union side. So they were technically still enslaved, but weren't because they no longer were with their enslaver. Does that make sense? Okay. So they said, hey, sons, try and find some people who want to come to Minnesota and, tell them about the weather. Don't tell them too much, but make sure they're docile. Make sure they're of a certain disposition. Make sure they have certain types of personalities. Maybe find a man and a woman, so maybe they're more likely to stay. Or maybe we should bring a few people so they have a little community. All of this is in the letters that are just sitting at Minnesota Historical Society. I wish everybody's letters were sitting somewhere. Because look, I'm not going to read all of this to you, but They're just full of so much information. So remember that name, Mary, that was in the records with them? They actually talk about her in the letters. So they talk about Mary. She's giving, so basically letters from home announce the arrival of Mary, giving glowing accounts of her appearance and abilities, right? Because they wanted a certain kind of person. So they made sure she was that. They were really excited about her work. They said she walks off with the work. I assume that means she just did a great job. And so they were really excited. The neighbors started saying they wanted people too. They said, okay, great. Can you find some more people to bring up? So we don't know if that happened. We don't know if they found. So it says right here, other people are asking, you know, they want to procure contraband help too. So this was such an amazing find, not just because we got to hear people's opinions, people's personal voice, but also this is one of the first places I actually saw a way people arrived in Minnesota. Because remember, that's what's so hard to find, is the actual information that says how somebody got from somewhere like Kentucky up to Minnesota. The other way people arrived was actually through General Sibley. He put, and this is in the newspaper, a request for contrabands. Think about it. The Dakota War and the Civil War were going on at the same time. And especially here in the rural communities, that was a lot of men gone. There was a lot of men working the farms, not available. So they realized with that labor shortage, they needed to find people to come up. So General Sibley said, let's get more of those contrabands and bring them up to Minnesota. I have not found records yet, but somebody told me they exist at Minnesota Historical Society, some of them, that talk about the numbers. Because my thing is, the military does nothing better than keep records. I don't know if anybody knows much about the military, but they keep records on everything. So I believe that somewhere there are lists. Somewhere there are documents of who came, where they came from. I haven't found them yet, but I think I'm gonna. So, speaking of veterans, not only did people come before the Civil War, or were they brought by Civil War soldiers, some people were veterans themselves, and they came up after the war. One example of this is Alex Robinson. Has anybody ever heard of him? So Alex Robinson, these are both him. These pictures are from Carleton College, which was a great find. Not just one, but two pictures, because as you see, we haven't had any pictures of anybody yet. So Alex Robinson actually served with John Boone, remember, who came way early. So he and John Boone served together in Missouri, because that's where Alex was from. He was enslaved there. He escaped, crossed the Union lines, and worked for one of the white units in the Civil War. When the colored troops started, he enlisted. He met John Boone. John Boone's life in Northfield must have been pretty decent, because he said, again, my words, not his, I have none of his words, hey, come back to Northfield with me. You can make a life there. And so he did. So Alex Robinson and his wife Eliza, we'll talk about in just a second, because I'm still not sure how she got here. I think I know though. They moved to Northfield. My thought is Eliza's from Kentucky. John Boone and everybody else was also from Kentucky. I believe that Eliza came with a second group who came from the free people who came from Kentucky. I think she was in another group that came up from there. Now again, we've got two pictures of Alex, no pictures of Eliza. But Alex actually went on to work at Carleton College. He worked as the chief engineer, and he worked with the boilers. So he was kind of like the custodian, but his work with the boilers was actually noted. So he got recognition for his great work. And from everything I've known about boilers, especially when he was working there, that was actually a kind of skilled labor job to be able to work with those boilers. So again, born enslaved, he fought in the Civil War. He and John Boone were very proud members of the GAR, which is the Grand Army of the Republic sort of veterans post. They were founding members, both of them, and served very, very proudly. If you notice both of these pictures, he is wearing his Civil War medals, and this is actually a medal from the GAR. So I'm going to skip a couple people just because we're in Rice County and also because of time. Just real quick, this is Sim and Flora Boggs. The one thing I want to say about them, just so you can hear one more story about how people got here. They both were enslaved. They both escaped. But the story of how this is Flora right here, she escaped by fleeing in Louisiana. She had a young infant, and I only know this because she was able to tell somebody who wrote it down, and it's actually published in the newspaper. So her story was published, and that's why we know that she's a young baby. And she was running to get across big fields to find where the Union line was. At some point, she actually set her baby down because she's just like, I gotta be free. I have to be free. The baby's slowing me down. She went back for her baby, got her child, and then continued and made it to the Union lines. That's where she met Sim, because he was actually fighting with that unit. They met while they were there. They married while they were there. And they both ended up coming to Minnesota with the person who was in charge of their unit. Again, a lot of Minnesotans were in charge of the black units, a lot of white Minnesotans. They brought them back with them, actually to Dodge County, Mantorville. Has anybody heard of Mantorville? Okay. So in Dodge County, so that's where they lived. They were very well known in the town, just, regular folk, but well known. They were in their church congregation. These actually are pictures from their church congregation, which is why we have photos of them. So I just think it's really interesting how people got here, what happened with their lives afterwards. And again, photos, oh my gosh. So a lot of the people, if I found photos, I did try and show those people because it was just such an amazing thing to have photos of people. This is actually a tribute that was written about Sim when he passed. So I'm gonna read it just in case this is a harder font for some people. It says, Sim was a slave. Sim Boggs, or Boggs as we called him at roll call, was a man. On guard to his salute, the general himself was bound to return the salute. So, that says a lot about what kind of man he was, right? What I've noticed, though, is the men who came up here who were veterans had a different life. I think there was some camaraderie with some of the other vets, right? Some of the white vets. There was a shared experience. I've noticed that across all wars. There's a shared experience of what it was to be a soldier, what it was to have been in battle. And maybe it says something about what their character may have been. And there was a different level of acceptance for a lot of the men who had been soldiers. But not everybody was a soldier. So this photo is a Rice County Historical Society photo. We have a gentleman here. We have not figured out who he is yet. We're gonna figure it out though, or we're gonna at least try and narrow it down at some point. So I really love this photo because this is what it would be. It's usually just the one person, right? The one man working, being a laborer. This was building Seabury Hall. So early, obviously, in time. This was my very first family I ever found. So they're my favorite story. I'm gonna keep it short though. As you see, I like to tell stories. I think that's what makes everybody come to life, So this is Joseph and Amelia. Joseph also was a Civil War soldier, but his story, I think, is more typical of a lot of people who came, and that's why I think his story is so important. So Joseph came. Again, I have no clue how he came from Kentucky to Minnesota, but he was also here fairly early. He worked in Owatonna. He worked in Red Wing. He worked in Rochester. He worked a couple other places. So a lot of people, what they did is they just went where the work was. Think about it. That's what a lot of people did. They came and they worked for other people. So he was a farm laborer. Wherever there was work, that's where he went. So he bopped around a lot of different places. He actually worked for a while at the St. James Hotel. And his family, so I know I've met his family. So they are the ones that are holding those two pictures. They gave me those pictures. And this letter is also in the family possession. It's a letter from the proprietor of the St. James Hotel. So it's his letter of reference. So when he left there, he was able to take his letter of reference to go work somewhere else. This is an amazing find and so rare. What I've learned about this project more than anything is how precious any document is. The documents just are not as easy to come by as I have seen in some of my other genealogy work. Oftentimes it's our descendants or us who are holding the records of our families, right? We're holding that knowledge. But sometimes in families where people had to move a lot, they don't keep that stuff. If you don't have a farm or a homestead where you lived for 2 or 3 generations, You might not have some of the same papers and same photographs that you would have if every few years you were renting and moving and renting and moving, and everything you had to pick up and be able to carry with you. So a lot of times that's how the photos aren't with the family anymore, or these amazing pieces of paper. So this one I'm going to do kind of fast. This is actually in Houston County. I found in Houston County in this census this huge group of people, all with different last names. Again, most people around them are marked as white. There's a couple white people in here, but mostly B and M for black or mulatto. This family, I was like, wait, this is a huge group of people. Where are they? And I realized they were in Houston County. Would never have occurred to me. So this is a family with property. They owned their lands. So this family was 3 groups of people. Lewis Harrison actually brought other people in to live with him and created on his land he owned his own little community. So not everybody stayed. People would kind of come in and out. I would find different census records, different groups of these people living together, other people coming to live with them. But in Houston County, they created their own community. And that's really been the other thing is there a community? Do people live around each other? Do they know each other? How would they meet each other? You know, nobody could call on the phone. How did you know there was another black family living in your county? Did somebody just tell you? Maybe they did, and maybe that's how they met. Because none of those people have the same last name. None of them are even from the same state. So it's hard to know how did they meet. But he actually got his patent and he owned his own land. He had a homestead, which is one of the only ones I found to date. Not very many African Americans were able to get homesteads for various reasons in Minnesota, especially this part of Minnesota. Some of it is because the land just got gobbled up so fast. Some of it is because some people intentionally lost their applications. They may have said it's not filled out properly, even if it was, right? Some of that really subtle discrimination that people actually still do to this day. But I thought that was a really cool story. So not everybody was a farmer. Not everybody was a laborer. Again, like I showed you earlier, some people had their own businesses. Barbering was one of the biggest businesses for early African Americans all over the entire state of Minnesota, not just in this area, also in St. Paul, also in everywhere, barbering. And it took me a little while to figure out why, and I did some research into this, and some other historians have done amazing work on this. Barbering was a skill. You could open up your own shop, so now you sort of have this step into almost a middle class, right? That middle class life. You're a shop owner, you've got your customers. If you could become a barber, you had this sort of best of both worlds. A lot of the barbers were very politically active, like the one I told you about before. They were almost like conduits. Think about all the conversations that go on in the barber shop, right? Everybody knows the business if you work in a barber shop. If people needed help, they could say, I know a guy. It could have been another of the early African Americans. They could help people find jobs. Oh, you need a farm laborer? I know a guy. I can get you somebody. So they were great resources for their community, both the black community and the white community. But not everybody was a barber. So Alexander House, this one's in Olmsted County in Dover. Alexander and Edith House were this amazing couple. They're really like this bootstrap, if you like or don't like that term, family. Alexander was born in Alabama. He was born in the 1850s. He was an orphan. Somehow, again, I don't quite know, he came to Olmsted County. It's possible there's a Civil War soldier he's always living around. So it's possible when one moved, the other moved, that there's a connection between them. It's a white soldier. But if he was an orphan child, it makes you wonder, did somebody in that, it was the Minnesota 2nd. Did somebody take him in, take pity on him? Was he a helper for them and they wanted to bring him back with them? Nobody knows quite what got him to Minnesota. But he came to Minnesota, he started out again, farm labor. He ended up working for a mill. As a mill worker, he worked his way up. He went from being a laborer, helping build things, to an engineer, to a grain buyer. And he actually became a grain buyer who worked and sold grain to the Cargills. So he was doing pretty well for himself. He and his wife ran a hotel. So not only was he a grain buyer, he was elected by the town to be a meat inspector. So he would go back and forth to Chicago, back and forth to Kansas City, to the stockyards to help pick the beef and different types of meat to bring to town. So I tried to research him, and it's almost nowhere does it list him as African American. So it's really interesting to note that sometimes people sort of either reach a certain status where they don't talk about it anymore, or sometimes people are just well enough known in town. It's like, oh, well, we know them. They're part of our community. We don't need to add that detail because they're just one of us now. Sometimes that's what happens. But he was really well known. He's all through the newspapers. But you guys, there's no pictures of him. None. No pictures. But in the newspaper, constantly, all kinds of great articles, no pictures. I'm really hoping that somebody in his family somewhere has a picture. So this is the best we got. This is the depot. In Dover when he would have been there. And there's one of the grain elevators in the background. I don't think that was the one for which he worked. But it would have been quite similar. So I just like this. I'm not going to tell Eli and Eliza Field's story right now, but I just thought this was a great photo, or image, I guess, to really talk about, think about it. When we think about hairdressers today, I would always think, I'm going to go to a hairdresser who has hair like mine. They're going to know how to do my hair. They're going to know my texture of hair. They're going to know how to style my hair, right? And so back then, if you're going to a black barber, they probably weren't quite styling their own hair like this, but they were quite good at styling other people's hair. But I just love this picture to think about how somebody's hair may have been. This is from, I think it's like 1896, I think is the year on this. So, is it? Okay, good. That's the one I pulled. I had two. I couldn't remember which one. Thank you for noticing that. So 1884. I don't know if anybody sees a hairstyle that they're fond of that we want to go back to. My personal favorite is the half shingle here in the middle. Just part it and don't do anything else. Okay, oh, this doesn't blow up very nicely. That's okay. Hopefully you can see it a little bit. So I was talking earlier about community, right? If there's only 4 black people, if even, and they're all related to each other in a town, they're clearly not going to just have a black community inside of the larger white community. They're going to become part of the community, which is normal, especially in small towns, right? Try and bring everybody in. If you think about helping each other. So a lot of people bridged the communities. Again, they're part of both their smaller black community, if there even one existed in their town. But oftentimes, even if it didn't, it was a larger black community. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. A fabulous example of this is Mr. Benjamin Franklin Day, or Professor Ben, as he was called here in town. He's not from here, but this is where he lived. So Ben Day was born in Wisconsin in the 1840s. His story is very different, and part of the reason I like to show it is there's a sort of idea that everybody came up from the South. He came from Wisconsin. He didn't come from very far away. He was born in Wisconsin. His dad was a barber. He was a barber. His brother was a barber. And like many of the barbers, they took in apprentice barbers. So other black barbers would come and study with them. So he grew up not only learning from his dad as his own son, but also watching his dad teach other barbers how to be a barber. It's a lot of time saying the word barber. So Ben Day, at some point, he moved here. He moved to Northfield, and he also kind of went back and forth between Northfield and Faribault for a while. He had barber shops in both. Eventually, he did settle here, though. I don't know how he met his wife, but she was 15 when they got married. And she'd been from Ohio, moved to Wisconsin, and the two of them moved here. So in addition to being a barber, he was a well-known and well-established caterer. People would have him come in and cater for them. They talked about all kind of foods, possum and all kind of stuff he made. That has anybody had possum? Is it good?
I was little. So
oh, okay. The was enough for me. I was like, but it was a delicacy for somebody. So, he was really just enterprising. He had his businesses. He had his side hustles, as they call them these days. And this picture that was found by Sue is this awesome example. So this is a photograph, And I think on the back, New Year's Day, right? New Year's Eve? New Year's Day. New Year's Day. So this is a group of carolers. All white carolers standing in the back, and as you see, Ben sitting in the front. Now, on the back, it says he was the coachman, which means he might have just been their driver. But that doesn't look like a man who was just the driver. Do you guys think? He's sitting almost in a place of prominence in front of all of them, with his ear listening maybe, we don't know. He's got his brochure that I wish we could blow up and see. Doesn't it seem like you just want to know what it says? Because they're holding it intentionally for us to see. He was a well-known, clearly well-liked man around town. And this photo is actually from his obituary. Look at that photo. Not a lot of photos in obituaries, but he had a big one. And even in his obituary, it says that all of his pallbearers, and this was in a black newspaper, it says all of his pallbearers were white men, his friends from the old times. I love that. But he was somewhat of an early member around town, right? 1860s, he was in Milwaukee. 1870s, he was here. So fairly early, he was here. And I still wish there were photos of his wife. As usual, there's no photos. But his kids ended up moving up to Minneapolis. Some of them worked, at least one of them was a nurse, and she did a lot of work with the Red Cross. So there's photos of his children that I've seen in some of the newspapers up in the Twin Cities. So that's been exciting to find. Again, so the thought is, this might be him. We haven't been able to confirm it yet. We're gonna dig though. And if it is, these are Henry Whipple students. I don't know if anybody knows anything about the okay, I thought I was probably talking to people who knew more than I do about it. And if he is, we're still trying to figure out why he was called Professor also. He was called Professor Day by a lot of people, or Professor Ben. Some people say that's because maybe he was more learned. Some people say maybe he did get some sort of degree, but he's only called professor in the local newspapers. He's not called professor in the newspapers in the Twin Cities. But I was talking earlier about community, and a lot of folks, again, they might have had a very small black community in their towns or in their cities, but people traveled. And this is the part that blows me away. People traveled to Iowa. People traveled to up to the cities. They connected. They wrote letters, even though a lot of people could not read and could not write. But somehow they were communicating with each other. There were picnics. This is actually in the newspaper. This is about a picnic for the colored people of Faribault celebrating the freeing of the slaves. So a lot of people, early African Americans, they didn't celebrate Emancipation Day or Juneteenth or the things we think about now. They celebrated the emancipation of when the West Indies emancipated its enslaved people. And I think that was like August 1st, I want to say, something like that. But this was one of these great finds because it doesn't just name him. So when I started to try and figure out who's in community with each other, I would get to look at things like this and try and pull out those names. Where did everybody live? Sometimes it would be people from just here, but as you see, it even has Constable Liddington, who I'm not going to talk about today. He's a great guy too, though. He was in Owatonna. So community is formed outside of just their towns. But obviously, Ben Day was still very connected to his local community, as you saw from that photograph. This is the second to last section. We got about 15 more minutes. So not everything was peachy keen for everybody, obviously. Not everybody was happy to have people that didn't look like them living here. Not everybody understood it. And so sometimes they would make funny jokes that weren't always funny to everybody. So Andrew Pratt was a colored man, as he was called here. He lived in Alden, but he also had a barber shop in Wells. Again, barbers, lots of barbers. He married a woman who was Danish, and their newspaper announcement was like this long because it was called An Interesting Wedding. Very Minnesota, an interesting wedding. And it goes on to describe everything. And it was a big enough deal. It didn't only make it in that paper, but it was in the Scandinavian newspaper as well. Because it was an interracial marriage. But again, I was like, yes, a newspaper article, something to give me some information about who they are and their lives. But this was something else. So their first two children were twins. Girls. Twin girls. who were the same color as each other. So the report was one was white, one was black. Rumors were going around town because it was already a thing that there was this interracial couple, and so when they had 2 babies, the rumor mill started flying. So kind of a tame example. I didn't present all of the not as tame examples, but I do have this one. This is from Red Wing. This is the 4th of July parade from, I should have put the date on there. Darn it. This was the I want to say the 1870s. Don't quote me on that. So this is just an ad in the newspaper for the local 4th of July parade, but they made sure to note that before the parade starts, so the parade was actually down here. The parade starts at 9, but at 8 o'clock there will be a grand parade of the Ku Klux Klan on horseback and velocipedes. Look out for the fun. So, you know, a lot of people think that was sort of a later thing, but 1870s, 1860s, 1870s, they weren't really there yet. So this must have been a little later, like 1870, maybe 1880s. I don't know. But the Klan was here for a while. Then they kind of went underground and came back sort of the 20s is when they had their big resurgence. But they were in some parts of our state. And I just think it's important to point that out. Now, they weren't only anti-black, they were anti a lot of people that didn't look like them. So it's hard to know when you see these things without context who they were against or who they were really parading to make themselves known for. But they were there, and I just think it's important to note. So that's kind of where we were, but it's not done. So I have more things to do. There's more research to find because we haven't found everybody. Even since this project, new things have happened. So I've been keeping, this is sort of like my behind the scenes. So if you ever want to know, like, what do we do behind the scenes? So I've been doing these census records, trying to find everybody in every single census. What was their name? How were they identified, right? So in this case, it was always a barber, mulatto, where they were from. But then sometimes we find these amazing things. I can't take any credit for this. This goes right over here to Sue. This was a great find. So this is the son right here. Never had seen a picture of him. He also became a person who was white passing, but his name was Walter Holmes. He was a doctor. So this happened after the project, but because of the project, I had these records. We'd heard of them. And so when Sue went looking for, you know, any information on the Holmes, we were able to be pretty definitive about what we found. They said, no, that can't be the right person because you're looking for a black man. We say, well, then they said, these are his parents' names. I said, I've got records. Those are the right people. So that's one step. It's just learning more, having partnerships with other historical societies and other people, because like I was showing you with some of the people, not everybody stayed in the same place all the time, right? They left. They left Rice County and moved to Norman County. I wrote it down. And they moved to Norman County, and that's where he ended up having his doctor, his medical practice. And so we have to make those partnerships. You know, the stories are out there, the photos clearly exist, but they're not necessarily just in one place. The other thing that I've been working on and want to keep doing with this project, and we've been doing together as well, is not only finding pictures, but finding their homes for them. So the 2 pictures on the left, they are the wife and children of a man named Calvin Simmons. He was brought up to Minnesota. It's very unclear if he was brought up free or enslaved, and it's very unclear if he was kept free or enslaved once he arrived in Minnesota. That's a whole different story that isn't for today, but there were people who were enslaved down here too. But those are his kids. Those were up for auction in California randomly. And somebody in South Dakota, which is where that family ended up, bought them. They're somebody who's with, I think it's Clay County Historical Society in South Dakota. They bought them and they've had them. I found them. We were in contact. I found the descendants. They live in St. Paul down the street from my sister. Super random. And she knows them. She's like, yeah, I know them. So now my goal is to get the pictures either back to the people or copies of the pictures so they can at least see they may never have seen these photographs before, because remember I was telling you, people's pictures end up in weird places. You would not expect to see your family photos in an auction in California, but somewhere along the lines the family lost track of them, either intentionally, whatever happened, and so that's one goal. The other goal, this is an unidentified man from here in Rice County, is just to figure out who the heck everybody is. So that's just another step. We just really want to figure out who are people. You know, you don't want unidentified people. It'd be really great to know who people are and just be able to tell their stories and learn about them. Because this dapper young gentleman right here, he was somebody, and it'd be great to know more about who he was.